absolutely delighted to introduce our next distinguished speaker, Irene Hunt, a top global pharmaceutical and biotech commercial expert with a proven track record of building commercial infrastructure, launching and growing brands, and optimizing product value at companies such as Johnson & Johnson, Biogen, and Novartis. Irene led the introduction of 3 innovative treatments for multiple sclerosis, improving clinical outcomes for patients while resulting in billions of new revenue for Biogen and Novartis. As the Vice President of Chronic Care Marketing at Novartis, she continued to evolve treatments of COPD, osteoporosis, and Alzheimer's disease. Irene is currently acting as the business advisor within the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Business Program. Please let us welcome Irene.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Anastasia, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and to follow Kevin, who did a fabulous overview of the process and some of the key elements within a launch. And what we thought I would do is maybe talk a little bit more of specifics along the way. So if we go to the next slide, please. When you're looking at some of these, here you see beyond orals and beyond oral solids, when you think about all the new therapies that are emerging, they will change the marketplace, as many of them have. Especially, I've been privileged to work with monoclonal antibodies in multiple sclerosis with Tysabri. But each of these will actually change the way care is driven. So along the way, as you're developing some of these therapies or some of these diagnostics or some of these delivery methods, we really have to think about what new systems and protocols have to be in place to get the benefit to the patients. And I think that's where some of it gets back to along the way during the process. What are ways that you can determine this? Next slide, please. And I went back and looked. This is dated from 2019, just so we had the full year of sales dollars. And obviously, this changed in 2021, 2020, and as it's going year to date. But the interesting thing is you look at these blockbuster therapies, you see the monoclonal antibodies, how they've really changed therapies. You see the immuno-oncology products, how they've changed. But besides seeing all the big companies on here, you could do a case study on each of these therapies because you could see how they did a partnership, how they had to figure out globally how to access the market, like Amgen wanted to have a global presence, so they partnered with Pfizer and Takeda. So it's very interesting on any of these products how they figured out what the optimal way to deliver the product was and then how they had to go about doing it. Next slide, please. So along the way, and currently, we are hitting challenges with successfully conducting clinical trials. And if you think right now with all the resources within the hospitals, how they've shifted dealing with COVID, but the costs within the systems have increased as they've consolidated. And the challenge for pharmaceutical companies and other companies trying to deliver these new therapies or the new issues are figuring out how to conduct the trials successfully and understand what's going on with each of the regulatory authorities, but then figuring out about pricing globally. And we'll talk more about that in a moment, but there's been so many shifts in pricing. So you have to understand where you might be coming in the marketplace and what some of those challenges are. And you have to understand that early. Next slide, please. So as Kevin said, in the end, what you want in your plan, these are the major elements within that global plan. And along the way, the earlier you can start, the better. But on any product profile, any vision of where you want your brand to be or where you want the therapy or the change in the marketplace, these would be the major elements that you would be developing along the way. Figuring out what's the big vision. And when I first was at Johnson & Johnson, worked on Risperdal, the brand manager said, Risperdal, a big drug for a long time. Now that was an internal vision, but it was a major change that everyone had to rally around from where that marketplace was a generic marketplace. And that was one of the first branded therapies that led several others that really changed that marketplace. The challenges were things like Medicaid in the US, or figuring out how it was going to be paid. So understanding that, understanding the image, and Michael's going to talk more about this, but the perceptions about the product, where you want to live in the consumer's mind, in the patient's mind, in the physician's mind. And then the goals are things like your share. Are you going after creating a market? Are you trying to take market share from an existing leader? Are you trying to a niche product with rare diseases? Are you trying to understand how that treatment flow might be? And setting up your strategy around those major elements, and then your objectives, your KPIs, and then the tactics designed to get you there. So all of these are evolving, but they are all important along the way. And as Kevin was going through, these are all what you're trying to get at. So where do you focus? How are you going to be successful? What actions to take? And then evaluating your plan. Along the way, how do you develop these things? Who's responsible? And then how do you move your team and the organization forward? And when we're looking at some of those top therapies, obviously those big companies have big resources. But as Anastasia and I know, when we worked at Novartis, there was no multiple sclerosis business unit. So even within a big company, you had to figure out how to gather resources and move it from other places in order to move forward. And you can't get those resources anywhere unless you're able to tell the plan. So this might be getting resources from an IPO, or it might be getting resources within a company. You need the plan in order to do that. Next, please. So the first part, and Kevin went through this, but you do not have to have a big company come in and help you do some of these things, but you have to have a way within your firm or within your team of gathering these elements about what really a deep environmental analysis. What is it you're going into? Or what are you trying to create from what nugget of information do you have? So these would be all the things that you were trying to understand, go deeply as you're developing your plan. Next slide. And these might be some of the things you're getting at, right? So if you're doing this environmental analysis, what are you trying to get at? So within the disease, you're trying to understand what is changing in that disease. Are there new markers, biomarkers? Are there new ways of measuring success? Are there new ways of delivering the product? In the stakeholders, you have to understand, who are you talking about? If you're in hemophilia, you're talking about very targeted treatment centers for patients. If you're talking about multiple sclerosis, there was a movement trying to understand where were MRIs in the beginning. So you had to really understand what's going to change for each of these key stakeholders, and who are your stakeholders. Obviously, pricing and access, always a challenge, but what can you do early on in development to deal with some of those challenges? And then who's going to be your competition, and what might they do in advance of your introduction? Next, please. Just one thing here, we talk a lot about the pressure on physicians, and now when you see the systems, especially in the US, where practices are integrating and getting larger, and then you're seeing what's happening within hospital systems, you have to understand what's going on with physicians in that category. Whatever, are you talking about primary care? Are you talking about specialists? Are you talking about oncologists? So you have to understand what's happening to them with how many sales reps are they seeing? And in COVID times, how were they seeing sales reps? Were they doing it online? Were they allowing people? Are sales reps going to be allowed into institutions, into hospitals? Are they going to be allowed back in the same access? But what are some of the practice management changes that are coming through? What's the reporting burdens on doctors? So keeping that in mind. And at the same time, doctors and physicians and KOLs want to move ahead with the new therapy, but at the same time, they need to understand the trade-offs, and there better be a good benefit risk ratio for the doctors to make a major change, and you better have aligned the KOLs to do that. Next slide. And whatever your therapy or your practice that you're integrating into the market, you have to go through each of these key stakeholders and really define who they are for you. And the KOLs, as we always say, are the ones for you that are at the top of the pyramid that will help you either understand the protocols that have to be followed, the change in treatment patterns. How are you going to deliver the product? What's the major change that you want to bring in multiple sclerosis? In the early days, the major change the companies brought in the earliest days was actually having patients self-inject IM or sub-Q therapies. And that was a major change in a chronic disease. And that moved along as the therapies changed, but that was a major change in that time period. So you had to involve the prescribers, you had to create multiple sclerosis nurses that didn't exist. You had to understand the role people with MS had or any patient has, and how will they get involved in the decision making. And for chronic therapies, the physicians will lean a lot on what the patients want and what their families want. And then understanding the payer dynamic. Is it a medical benefit? Is it are PBMs going to be involved? What data do you have to bring? So all of this really you have to have a deep understanding of this. Next slide, please. And on each of these, you could say each of those 4 blocks were a different customer. So you want to understand where they came from and what their journey. We talk a lot now about the patient journey, but basically that's understanding what are the flow of information as patients are moving through, as doctors are moving through the treatment, what's happening with them and what's their experience, what do they need to do moving forward. And that really brings us into segments. Next slide, please. So you've heard about market segmentation in different categories, and ideally, depending on what data you have available and what data you can use to make decisions. So it's not data or segments just for the sake of it, but it's really understanding what are the natural segments, or what segments can you work with both in the patient population. Is there a group of aggressive treatment people that desire aggressive treatment? There's others that want to go a different route. And then the same within the physicians. And in each of your groups, you should think about what are the different segments, because you will have to have a different customer value proposition for each of those main segments. That means you're not moving your positioning around, but you have to understand where you bring value. You have to understand that value statement. And your message can vary by segment, even within the same positioning. So that's critical to understand. Next slide, please. And again, as you're following this journey, as you're understanding the pain points for both patients, physicians, caregivers, and developing your customer value proposition, now you have to understand what ways can you deliver that message. And this is in the planning segment where, as Kevin went through, when you're doing a lot of this earlier, it doesn't mean you're going out with a DTC or DT direct to patient program right away, but you have to understand that early on so that you're developing the materials and developing those channels that are the ones you're going to need to exercise later and to execute your plan. Next, please. So with that, I wanted to move into a little deeper discussion on what is it you're offering? What is the brand? And first, you need to be objective. Obviously, there's always a lot of excitement with a brand or a program that's in clinical development and what the outcomes could be. You have to, especially from the commercial side, bring that objectivity. And this is a simple chart of looking at some of the major components or the attributes, the product attributes on safety, efficacy, dosing, and look at the competition now and the likely competition when you come to market, and be objective about what you are bringing. And you want to make sure this is a team view, but that you know where some of your elements are, as well as what's important to the organization. And that brings you might hear the product brand laddering up. And that's where the base of the ladder starts with being objective on what attributes you have. And then you have to bring that up to, so what? How do these attributes bring you some functional benefit? How do they help bring a benefit to either the physicians, the patients? And then what does that mean as you keep bringing up to the how the experience is and what do you need to add to the brand to make that experience better. And in many therapies, that was in patient services. Do you need to help with reimbursement? Do you need to help with scheduling, where to get treatment administered? So all of that will come along with as you're really objectively managing your brand. Next, please. And I wanted to just a moment on global pricing. And as we've seen with many factors, we're seeing a change in the free pricing, less controls, if you will, more in the US market. And then what you see in the direct price controls in most of the European countries. But you have to understand that as a company, as you're launching, where are you trying to position yourself? And then what are you going to do to try to help the countries, as you're working from a global side, gain access? And that is a very early planning process if you're going to bring data to the individual countries on what they need to access a market eventually. And it may be timing. It may take 5 or 10 years to fully access. So you're launching in one country or set of countries, and then over time you will continue to launch. You have to try to manage your pricing position and make sure you're generating the right data over time. And those factors on the next slide, no, you were right, sorry. Yes, these are some of the factors on the budget pressures that you have to consider in the early planning stages in order to figure out what's going to happen in that marketplace. And especially in some rare diseases where it's a small population and a small number of payers, and you're trying to carve out a benefit, or you're trying to carve out some data that you can show real world experience, or you can show some kind of technology to help the countries actually gain approval. And that has to be a key priority for the global team early on. Next, please. So the next couple slides, I just wanted to give an example, as Kevin has stated, and what I was trying to bring along here, as you're doing your overall planning and identifying where you want to be, what's your vision and the strategy, and as you're identifying these key issues, the critical success factors, and how you're going to do that, this is a global plan that is across all functional areas. And as we look at some of the examples of what these might be on the next slide, this is just an example therapeutic area that you might have. Here's some key issues: that you're not an established leader, you have multiple products in a category, or there's a lot of competition. So these are all the issues that the team may have synthesized, and then you're developing what you have to do in order to manage that issue. These are different terms in different companies: critical success factors, key performance challenge, but overall you're trying to identify where you're going to gather your resources and what's the focus going to be. On the next slide, I wanted to show how, yes, this is an issue that everyone was dealing with. This one talked about more an early choice for early efficacy, a switch pattern. So the team identified that. But what I wanted to highlight here is that that same issue is across commercial, medical, access, or health economics. And in that case, what you're trying to do is make sure whatever resources you have in your company or with your partners, that you're dividing those, which is the best department in order to meet that issue, which group has the most success. And here, especially when we're just talking about pricing and access, you have to have a strong health economics team or managed markets team to really understand what they're going to need to help you gain access globally. Next. So in wrapping this up now, as we've tried to do, is give you a sense of what the planning would look like, what are some of the elements in a plan you're trying to develop over time, and what you're trying to do to successfully introduce whatever you can bring to market, your product, your diagnostic, your method for delivering a product, is that all of these factors have to be considered and developed over time in a plan that you are integrating the company efforts so that you're getting the most from every effort, from every limited dollar, that you really have everyone. If you can't tackle everything, at least if you can tackle a few things in the best possible way, you will ensure that you have success going forward. So I hope this was helpful and gave some sense of things. And it was a pleasure being able to share some of these thoughts with you today. Thank you. Anastasia and Mike, back to you.
Thank you, Irene. It was a pleasure working with you on multiple sclerosis, and you've been very eloquent describing some of the challenges and approaches that we took. The one thing that we learned is the smaller the market, the more complex it gets. And this was a shift in our mindset and our approach, especially from the market insights analytics side, because a lot of the practices that we had in the past really didn't apply. So this was a lot of learning for us. And again, your leadership was extremely valuable for us to accomplish all of our goals. So thank you.